Just Another End of the World by Maxim Jakubowsky. This story was only ever published in a Robert Sheckley-edited anthology from September 1980 called After the Fall, republished in December of the same year with new cover art. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Just Another End of the World. When the acid rains fell, we were all in the convention's hospitality lounge, lazing about or playing pool. Whether the heavy rains were actually part of World War III or just an ominous portent of darker things soon to follow, I do not know. They came in awful quietness in the small hours of the night, with little spectacular or melodramatic rolls of thunder or pyrotechnic lightning. Some girl remarked, "Oh, it's raining outside," but we attached no importance to this, stoned, tired, or just gently drunk that we were all. In retrospect, maybe we should have begun worrying then. It was deepest summer and the weather had been splendidly consistent and hot for the last few weeks. When the pieces fell out of the sky, literally, I was sitting in some dark corner chatting up an attractively nubile Swedish sub-editor with incredibly deep gray eyes, a complexion the color of pale roses, and a figure that had me gasping with delight long before I had even maneuvered myself towards laying a hand on her. Trout and Joe Harovitt were arguing loudly about some royalties due on an anthology one of them had recently got back into print. Priest and Sheckley kept on playing pool, handling their cues with almost as much dexterity as their typewriters. Brunner, as suave as ever, was practicing his heavily accented Albanian on a Yugoslav publisher, reminding him pointedly that there were still a few of his early ace double adventure novels that hadn't seen the light of day in Zagreb. My blonde companion, Agneta, looked up and said, "There are things falling from the sky," which sounded more French than Swedish, but ours is not to reason why. "So they are," I said, not even looking in the direction of the window. Nothing was going to deflect me from my course of action. A rebuff the night earlier from a woman who, on first being approached by me, "Hello, and who are you?" had informed me with a joyous smile all over her face that, "Oh, I'm just the wife of a rock musician, and I have a beautiful 18-month-old baby," was enough for one convention. Then Colvin, deeply ensconced in an armchair near the lounge windows, dozing in a cloud of pot, appeared to wake up and screamed, "Bloody hell, it's a fucking pandemonium out there!" And when the sky went fiery red, we all stopped what we were doing and peered anxiously out of the windows and watched in silence as the lights of the world went off. The sky shifted like a mad laser show through a rainbow of colors dug up from hell and elsewhere. "I think this is it," someone said. "Yeah, the very last convention," added a joker. I went for the phone. The line was dead. "What did you expect?" Jake Ash asked me. "The power's gone. I think nobody should leave this lounge for the time being. Lock the door." When the darkness came, harder than coal, blacker than the blackest night, I think we all sort of shivered, realizing that some of our worst imaginings and dreams were actually becoming reality, and this time around, we weren't going to be paid for them either. A historic moment, I thought, ironically. Here comes World War III, and I'm witnessing the end of science fiction, standing here hopeless, scared shitless in the midst of a science fiction convention. No doubt the 50 or 60, 58, we later found out, writers and editors present were all thinking along similar lines. Together with the darkness came the silence as we quickly realized The time for jokes was over. A heavy silence, redolent of eternity. Just a cough here, some guy sniffing there, or a woman trying to contain her tears. I felt a hand in mine. Agneta. She moved closer to me. My eyes were still locked onto the blank landscape of desolation beyond the closed windows of the hospitality suite. I felt the warmth of her body against mine, stirring my loins and other delicate parts of my anatomy. "If this is how it's all going to end," a voice in the dark room said, "I know how I'd want to go." Some women sighed. Agneta's nails were already frantically scratching my back, digging into my flesh with sheer desperation. If it's radiation, I reflected, we've only a few hours left. My mouth reached for hers, tongues establishing contact, a bridge, moist, pleasurable feeling. Similar sounds filtered through to us from around the large room. At any rate, science fiction writers are realists, I mused, as we lowered ourselves to the floor in a frantic embrace. It wasn't radiation. They'd probably used some new clean weapons and bombs, but it was the end of the world. That is, the world as we used to know it. In the morning, charcoal gray sky peering through the windows, surprised at all still being alive, we looked at each other shiftily, a bit red in the face, somewhat embarrassed by the sexual excesses of the previous night. We dressed and moved uneasily around in the room that now smelt disagreeably of rancid smoke, sweat, and sundry other excretions. "Well, I feel fine," said Mike Jones. "So do I." "No trace or feeling of sickness," said Sid Snot. "What now?" We talked a lot amongst ourselves, argued a great deal, trying to remain rational, but then decided unanimously that something should be done. We would open the door, at least explore the rest of the hotel, and later maybe venture outside. Those first few days after the catastrophe are not memories I wish to dwell upon at length, although all these years later I still often awake in the middle of the night, shivering, sweating profusely, heart of ice, heart of glass, remembering the desolation, the corpses, the smells, the decaying bodies, the dead children, the despair, the fear, the animals, the mass graves we had to dig, the sheer absurdity of it all. Why us? Why them? But the most eerie thing was to cross the empty cities, littered with the rotting leftovers of civilization, derelict but still somehow alive, shop windows still full of glittering goods, all now ours, but somehow suddenly devoid of any real attraction. Of course, with all our combined literary apocalyptic background, we should have known what to expect. After all, wasn't this just another end of the world? For days, we thought our time on Earth wouldn't last much longer, that the loophole that had allowed our freak survival would tighten on us, that the reprieve was only temporary. Naturally, we came up with many theories, easy and abstruse, but whoever was right was of little importance. The only thing that now mattered was that, through some unknown fluke, we were now the only survivors. The hospitality lounge of the convention hotel had inexplicably been spared the horror of the Great Death. In the outside world, the buildings still stood, generally unharmed, the factories, the fertile fields, but every other human being had succumbed. Instantly. At least, seemingly painlessly. Having recognized that there only seemed to be us, talk changed from past science fiction end of the worlds to our present predicament, and we heartily began making plans. Some of us cycled. Using abandoned cars was too problematic. The lack of electricity to man the pumps rendered further petrol supplies problematic. To the nearest cities to obtain confirmation of the global state of the catastrophe. Tried radio stations. No other survivors were found. What had it been about the shelter of the convention hotel that had saved us? We never did find out, and the problem puzzles us still now. I remember writing a story just like this in the 60s, said Laurie Marsh. Oh, yeah? Remarked Sid Snot. And what did your survivors do? Rebuild civilization single-handed? Marsh sort of blushed inside his bushy beard and answered, Yes, with many attendant problems, but they managed it. I was a bit disappointed when the story didn't get a nomination for the annual prizes. So, we decided to rebuild civilization, or at any rate, a semblance of life. Oddly enough, the feminist writers and editors in our midst, or should I say former writers and editors, were the most vehement when it came to the delicate problem of procreation, the continuation of the species. The solution we arrived at was utterly logical, if a bit lacking in delicacy. I'd always been a bit of a sentimental bugger, even in my new wave speculative days. I wouldn't have minded one bit keeping sweet Agnetta's body all my own, but a controlled form of promiscuity was decided on for the final good of our human race, and so I obeyed the rules. Close your eyes and think of mankind become an occasional motto. We left the city and chose a small country village within easy distance. Food would be no problem for a long time. Supplies of canned goods were available in abundance in the stores of the area and would last more than a lifetime, and by then, anyway, the crops planted and planned would already be feeding the majority of our ersatz colony. We discovered a generator in a barn, and two of the ex-engineers in our group of writers were soon made responsible for energy matters, thus keeping our discomforts to a minimum. We were ready for it, but the lack of all the modern amenities we had previously been accustomed to was something else again. Jobs and functions were allocated as best we could according to the talents we had, prior to our willing slavery to the typewriter and the pen. We fortunately numbered 3 doctors, 2 nurses, various technicians, a botanist who came in very useful, Ike French, the biochemist whose knowledge was absolutely encyclopedic, an astrophysicist who was an expert at baking bread, a psychologist who soon switched to psychiatry and proved useful in soothing our frequent nightmares full of death and doom. A resourceful group. Having spent 4 years in merchant banking before going freelance quite some time back, I was given the job of administering the logistics of the settlement, Camp Tomorrow, as we now called it. Money didn't, of course, come into it, as there was no longer any need for it, but you'd be surprised at the paperwork involved in running everything smoothly, coordinating our varied but necessarily urgent activities. The first winter hit us hard, and we lost 3, among the oldest. But with spring came the first births. Agnetta's was the second, by a few days only, and although there was no way of being certain, the baby had a familiar grin and dimple in his chin that played havoc with the strings of my heart. We called him Adam, a symbolic name, the first man and all that. The first baby, born 48 hours earlier, had been a girl. Her name was Joanna, although the mother's name had been Eve. Work in the fields progressed satisfactorily, and we soon began making our first steps towards self-sufficiency. 2 elderly lady editors set up the nursery, and heated discussion quickly sprang up as to how we should educate the new children. Every single one of us had very definite ideas on the subject, and, not surprisingly, our views all differed quite radically. Compromises were reached. At about the same time, our chemists succeeded in modifying several old cars and tractors to run on our own homemade fuel made from waste material. Night. Watching the crimson sails of sunset gliding over the distant horizon of the Midwest plains, I couldn't help feeling perversely disappointed that things were working out for our ill-assorted group. It was just like another hack novel. Foiled again, Satan. The world will not end. Agneta was pregnant again, as were 11 other women. This was going to be a permanent feature of Our Ladies for many years to come. Adam was just about beginning to walk, stumbling joyful steps, twinkling eyes, healthy appetite, full of surplus energy. I closed my eyes, remembering the desolate landscape all the travelers to the ends of time in my stories of old had encountered. Images of emptiness and white, chalky desolations, cliffs of marble running into the dead seas, a sky the color of woe, silence eternal, sun fading fast out there in space, no longer bathing the planet with its flames of life. Of course, we now had the empty cities full of dread and past horrors, but we seldom ventured there any longer. Most animals had also died in the catastrophe, so the buildings and metropolis streets were safe, but the urban architecture only served to remind us of the first days after, the bodies, the utter despair, so we purposefully avoided them. Just a foray for stocks of canned food, spare parts, equipment, reading matter, or medicine every few months, in a safe group of at least 12. I opened my eyes. The sky was now darker, full of stars, every dot of light a beacon of hope for the future that lay ahead of us. I turned round. Agneta was sleeping. Her round belly bulged through the bed cover, a look of peace on her face. I walked silently towards the bed, kissed her gently on her lips, brushing stray hair away from her eyes, and joined her inside the bed. The wooden beams of the farmhouse creaked a little around us as the temperature outside grew colder. In the hearth, a small wood fire still shone red and warm. Time, healer of wounds. Seasons going by, rhythm of the crops, of the land, trees growing, plants and flowers born, dying, being reborn again. Cycles of life. Years, always so short, too short. One is gone already and another begins before you even realize. The children have grown, sturdy as trees, and the joyful noises from the school in the old Presbyterian church keep getting louder all the time. We don't require churches any longer. Soon there will be enough children to occupy the village school. Until now it had proved too large and unpractical for its originally designed function. Already, the first deaths from old age among our early contingent, Marsh, Steinberg, Korzeniowski, Orff, Francis Lengel, Luke, Ilya, sedentary bodies grown prematurely old because of the constant toil, the sweat, the hidden grief. Discreet autumn burials with no florid speeches or unnecessary sentimentality. Oh my, have we grown so hard and insensitive that we can no longer shed a genuine tear of bitterness? Today, Agneta discovered her first white hairs. I just smiled. I'd had mine since my mid-20s. Always thought they made me look distinguished. Funny how time goes by. Camp Tomorrow has become virtually self-sufficient with the coming of age of the second generation, while we original survivors gradually become redundant, useless, not strong enough any longer for the work in the fields or building the new block extending the old town hall. Adam now has 2 small children of his own, and the kids, as we all still call them, are becoming increasingly active in the organization council meetings, dealing with camp strategy and the day-to-day running of things. Yesterday, after the evening communal meal, some of us oldens got talking of old times, complaining of all the free time we now had and the ensuing boredom. I've finally read all Dostoevsky. What do I do now? And I, Proust. Maybe we should all start writing again, I suggested, half in jest. It's the only thing we used to do well, after all. Jake Ash roared with laughter. Best idea I've heard in years, he said. Most of the others agreed. I don't know if I could remember how again, remarked Frappenny, who had never been very prolific, constantly struggling with writer's block. But what's the point of us all writing again if no one is going to read us? Someone said. Well, why shouldn't they? I pointed out. There's a printing press in the basement of the old local newspaper offices. We could spruce it up, get it working again. I could feel shivers of excitement coursing through the smoked-up room. Their blood was once more pulsing in fourth gear. Paper? Trout asked. We won't find enough paper to print books by every one of us. Always a spoil sport, old Trout. Who's talking about whole books, novels? I said. We're too rusty for that yet, anyway. Let's all start writing short stories again. Yes, said Agneta. The editor in her was awakening, after all the years of motherhood and devotion to the cause. I've always been a sucker for thematic anthologies. But does it have to be science fiction? I asked, having once seriously flirted with the mainstream. Yes, they all shouted back in unison. And we've chosen our first theme, all fired by a common enthusiasm. At last, having rebuilt civilization, life now has a meaning for us old troopers of the imagination wars. The theme was obvious. It didn't take us long to find it. Everyone says he has absolutely great ideas. We've all sworn to outdo ourselves on this one. So, here I sit, chuckling mischievously, writing my own downbeat, end-of-the-world story, writing my life away.